Hello, hello, hello. Okay, mic is hot. PowerPoint is running. Turn that down. We are live. Okay. It is only just now 7 by my clock. And so we'll just give a few minutes for anyone else who wants to wander into our room here. Hey, welcome, guys. Glad to have you. So we'll just give a moment while maybe some other folks wander in. I'm going to grab me a drink. You talk amongst yourself. La la la. Okay. Just to have something to talk about, I have not been able to really mess with any other kind of platform in such a way that I'm comfortable with it and just want to barrel ahead and go through with it. So that's why we are still sticking with YouTube. It works. I know a lot of church members don't have YouTube accounts. If you have a Gmail, that is your YouTube account. You can log in that way. And so you're not able to get the comments and not having interaction. I know it's not quite the same thing as our previous Wednesday night Bible studies. Hopefully this will all be behind us very soon, and we'll be able to get back to life as normal, not the new normal. When you stop using that phrase, new normal, there's nothing normal about what is going on. We don't not let it become the new normal. We need to strive to return to normal. Okay. Also, coming up on April 26th, we are going to have our question and answer event. As usual, we have our quarterly question and answer panel. I'm still confirming with the other members if they will be able to participate. We'll stack the panel with somebody, but our regulars get first shot if they're able to pull it off. And so, so far, I think that Dave and Patrick have both said yes. And so we'll see who else jumps on board. I sent a message to Jay Medenwald, and so we'll see if I told him seats available if he wants it. Only this time, the Q&A, like I said, quarterly, we do the Q&A. The next one coming up would just naturally falls on the last Sunday of April, which is the 26th, which puts us square still living in the quarantine zone. And but we will still have the question and answer. It's going to be like this online. Working out how to do that with the other members of the panel. You'll be able to submit your questions. You'll be able to text them in. Church members, you get them to me ahead of time. I mean, just whatever. We'll figure this out. We'll make it work. Very into the Q&A thing. Okay, well, I'm not going to wait much longer because I do want to make sure I got plenty of time to get through it. And then if any questions do pop up towards the end, so better to have too little time than not enough. Anyone who jumps in can either just jump in where we're at, go back and watch the recording later. All right. So open with a word of prayer, and then we'll get right to it. Father God, we thank you. We thank you for this wonderful gift that you have given us of salvation. We thank you for all of the amazing teachings and blessings that you have given, that you have not left us to wander alone in this life, but you've given us direction and you've given us salvation. We thank you, and please help us to be able to learn, help us to renew our minds with correct knowledge and right thinking. In Jesus' name, amen. Okay. So, how do you prove the resurrection of Jesus? As you may have noticed, the title of this talk is called The Easter Two-Step. That's not a reference to dancing. We are Baptist and we do not dance. And the reason Baptists do not dance, have you ever seen a Baptist dance? Okay, there's all the evidence you need for why Baptists should not dance. No, we're not talking about dancing with the two-step. What we're going to do is we're just going to waltz on into the issue of the resurrection. We're going to dip into the scholarly evidence. We're going to swing on over to some right thinking and logical reasoning, and then we're going to take it for a spin. And that was my horrible jokes for the evening. I used them all up right there at the beginning. So how do you prove the resurrection of Jesus? Why does it matter to prove the resurrection of Jesus first off? Right? Because the resurrection of Jesus is the single most important event in the Bible. Arguably in the world, if it's true, it is the single most important event in the world. And we happen to have evidence which we can examine to know whether or not it is true. So, as Paul says in 1 Corinthians 15, he says that if Jesus is not raised from the dead, then we are still lost in our sins, right? Christianity is not true. Let's pack it in. Let's go home. Let's quit this. Let's go find something better to do with our time if Jesus has not raised from the dead. However, if Jesus has raised from the dead, that resurrection stands as vindication, as confirmation of his teachings, of his claims about himself and being the Messiah. And so that's why it's very important that we know, is this actually something that we believe? Oftentimes skeptics will say, what would it take for you to not believe Christianity? How could you prove Christianity false? Easy. If Jesus didn't raise from the dead, Christianity is false. But did Christ raise from the dead? Good question. So let's go ahead and jump into that. How do you prove the resurrection of Jesus? Well, step one, you have to have your pointer on. Step one is to turn on your remote. There you go. Step one is proper thinking. Right? As you approach the question, you at least have to have your mind in the right spot, not clouded with all kinds of crazy other ideas and things that don't actually have to do with the issue. About having right thinking and the way that you're going to examine the evidence has to be the proper kind of thinking. And so we want proper thinking. So what does proper thinking look like? Well, we're talking about Jesus. We know the Bible is going to come up. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to take the Bible as a collection of historical documents. If you want to answer the question about the resurrection of Jesus, you have to approach the Bible as a collection of historical documents. This kind of levels the playing field because critics do not get to just dismiss the Bible as being some religious, old, dusty religious book of myths and fables. Because a lot of times that's what some skeptics want to do, right? They just want to say, Bible, don't need it, forget about it, just nothing but myths and fables. Well, the problem is that's just not true. There are no historical New Testament scholars who address the 27 books of the New Testament as just merely myth and fable. Do they have religious content? Yeah. But they're historical documents, right? Whenever Paul sat down and wrote his letters, he wasn't thinking, let me make up some myths and fables. He was writing letters, giving actual information and thoughts and arguments and reasons and all that. He was giving information. It was not myth and fable. In the Gospels, the Gospel writers explicitly say why they are writing, and they're not writing down myths and fables. They're trying to say, hey, here's these things that actually happened. And so the documents of the New Testament cannot be approached as myths and fables. If that's how you're approaching it, just go ahead and exit the endeavor because you are not even equipped with the most basic understanding of trying to figure this out. There's no way you can get a right answer approaching it with such prejudiced biases. However, Christians, what we are going to do is we're going to approach them as historical documents, like any other historical document. That means we're not going to assume and appeal to inspiration and inerrancy. Now, don't get me wrong. I am a Baptist preacher. I'm a fundamentalist. Extra emphasis on the fun. And I definitely believe that the Bible is inspired by God and that it is inerrant. However, that's not the basis on which we're going to examine the evidence. We're not just going to say, God said so, believe it. We're going to actually look at them as historical documents. As we do that, we need to stay focused. The question we're asking is about the resurrection. Okay, that means whatever other baggage or ideas or thoughts or things that you struggle or wrestle with on other topics, they don't get drug in here because they don't affect it, right? Skeptics and critics love the problem of evil. Even believers, we wrestle with evil and suffering in life. And so you're like, well, did Jesus raise from the dead? Well, a loving God wouldn't allow evil. Well, whether or not a loving God would allow evil has nothing to do with the evidence for the resurrection. Different question. Oh, yeah, well, God doesn't answer prayers. Where is God? Why can't, I see him? Why can't I? Totally different issue. Has nothing to do with the evidence for the resurrection. What is your position on Genesis? Old earth, young earth, evolution. Hey, is it predestination or free will? What's going on here? The virgin birth. How can you believe that a woman who'd never had sex is going to give birth? All of those have their places and many, many others. Right? I've been in conversations where you trying to examine the evidence of this issue and someone goes, you believe a talking snake? Okay, whether or not there was a literal talking snake in the garden has absolutely nothing to do with resurrection, right? Did Jonah really get swallowed by a whale or a big fish? Has nothing to do with the evidence for the resurrection. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at the evidence for the resurrection. Stay focused on the topic. You have to use the right tools. Okay, this is a historical question. Ahistorical and historical. Ahistorical and historical. Which one is that one? This is a historical question. And so you have to use historical methodology. You have to use the right tools. So because a lot of people like to come at issues of Christianity or about religion or theology, metaphysics, morality, whatever, using the wrong tools. Oftentimes, this is because they're coming from a point of view that is what's called scientism. Now, we like science. We want science. Science is good. We use science. Science is a very useful methodology for attaining information about certain parts of the world and certain phenomena and things that take place. But science is a method and a tool with a purpose. Scientism is the idea that only science can give you the right answer at getting at truth. And that is just simply not the case. Let me prove it to you. Scientism basically says something along the lines that only science can provide knowledge worth having. Really? Did science tell you that? You cannot even get the basic definition of scientism with science. It implodes. It is what's called self-refuting. The whole idea collapses under its own weight because it cannot meet its own standards. Okay, so science has some things to offer, right? There's archaeological evidence. We won't really get into that today, but there's lots of it out there about the Bible. There's science actually talks about the crucifixion and the medical issues about why we know for a fact that Jesus died. We'll get into that, right? Because of science, not scientism. So you have to be sure your thinking is correct there. Then we have, and I know there's probably going to be some people who don't quite accept this, but I think that, well, it just seems to be true. What's called the principle of credulity. I heard this, it's Richard Swinburne, philosopher. I heard him say this and it just clicked and things fell into place. The basic idea is that you are rational to believe things are the way that they seem to be unless you're provided with a defeater. which is a reason or an evidence to show you they're not really that way. Okay, so you're sitting in your living room. It's cloudy outside, and you see water drops hitting the window, and so you think, looks like it's raining. That makes sense. That's sensible. That's rational. That's reasonable. It seems like it's raining. There's clouds outside. There's water on the window. Makes perfect sense. What if someone says, no, that's not the case. It's the neighbor's sprinkler. And they take you out and show you that the neighbor's sprinklers are going off and it's spraying on your window. Oh, okay. Now you know it's not raining. But before that, perfectly justified and reasonable to believe it's raining. In fact, it would be a little weird to look and see clouds outside, rain in the forecast, water on the window, but I don't think it's raining. Well, that'd be kind of weird. And so whatever is before us that just seems to be the case, you're rational and reasonable to accept and believe that. Another thing that you have to do with this proper thinking is if you've ever heard the statement that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, get that out of your head. Extraordinary claims do not require extraordinary evidence. First off, the term extraordinary is vague. What does extraordinary mean? What's extraordinary to you may not be extraordinary to me, right? If someone were to tell you, God spoke to me, right? There's people who'd go, whatever, that's extraordinary. Really? Because there's some people, that's perfectly normal. And so whatever is extraordinary is malleable. It changes. You can shape it. It's different for different people in different situations. So the whole idea is nonsense to begin with. However, any claim that you're making doesn't need extraordinary evidence. It just needs regular evidence, just whatever sufficient to prove the claim. It doesn't have to be extraordinary. Something I heard yesterday, a conversation I was listening to with Gary Habermas and Mike Licona, two scholars who are just wonderfully brilliant, and I will reference them in this talk. And something got brought up about how you don't need extraordinary evidence because a whole bunch of little pieces of evidence are just as good as a big one. Right, but we've all grown up on crime shows and courtroom dramas where we're wanting the person come running in right before, the judge is the gavel's about to fall, and someone comes in and goes, wait, Your Honor, and they have that piece of evidence that's just a bombshell, right? We want the smoking gun. We want the video footage. Well, you know what? Even in court dramas, in real life, that is not how most cases are done. It's bit by bit by bit of all the bricks, of all the evidence building up to paint a picture. And that's all you need. You don't need the extraordinary show. You just need something basic enough. Okay, we're almost through with this thinking thing, but you have to understand that if you're going to approach the question, you have to be in the right frame of mind, okay? So New Testament documents, historical documents. We are going to stay focused, right? We are not going to be approaching it as expecting that only science can prove things, right? It's a historical question. We want history to prove it. Whatever kind of seems to be the case of the evidence, that's what's rational to believe. We're not going to deal with all this extraordinary evidence stuff. And we also have to understand there is no default view. That there is no one who has a favored position that gets to say, I'm just right unless you can prove to me otherwise. That's not how that works. The evidence is laid out and you have to do something with it. Now, you can just choose to stick your head in the sand and ignore it, right? But everyone has to account for the evidence and what their position on it, right? If they're going to say, I don't think Jesus rose from the dead. Okay, you need to account for the evidence then because it indicates that he did. So if you're going to say no, well, then you're going to need some reasoning for that. Because it doesn't do anything to just simply say, I'm not convinced. Well, okay, but that doesn't mean anything. I love in a debate, Mike Winger discussion with Matt Dillahunty, and Mike Winger said this. He said, it's not because his opponent in the debate said, I'm not convinced. And he said, it's not my job to convince you. It's my job to present you with reasonable arguments and evidence. It's your job to be convinced by reasonable arguments and evidence. So we're going to have an open mind. We're going to let ourselves just accept what the evidence shows. We're going to be convinced by reasonable arguments and evidence. And besides, if people want to take a position where you say, well, I'm not going to make a decision. As the great Canadian poet once said, if you choose not to decide, you still have made a choice. Okay, so let's get into the resurrection. Let's take a look at what do we need in order to prove the resurrection? Let's put this question to bed. Did it happen or did it not? Well, here's the thing. Even if someone wants to cling to that extraordinary claim idea, we're not making extraordinary claims. We're making two very ordinary claims. I'm only going to do two. Gary Habermas, a new historian scholar, he has made popular, him and others have made popular what's called the minimal facts kind of argument for the resurrection, where he takes only the basic things that even critical, skeptical scholars are going to accept as facts. And then he takes those and he argues, here's why the resurrection happened. And I've heard different versions of this where, people use 3 or 4 facts. Some people use, 5 or 6. I've seen someone use, I think, like 18, facts. And then, okay, here's why all these facts show that the resurrection. I am being very ambitious tonight. I'm going to use 2 facts. That's all we need. That's all we need to show that there is a resurrection that has taken place. Because what do you need to know if someone has risen from the dead? Well, first thing you need is a dead person. Okay, so if Jesus rose from the dead, well, first he's got to be dead, right, in order to raise. That I know that just sounds so incredibly simple, but there it is. So do we have evidence that Jesus actually died? But then what else do you need in order to show there's a resurrection? That Jesus died, but then that also Jesus was seen alive. There you go. Dead here, alive here. Resurrection proven. Okay? So that's what we're going to do. We're going to take a look at this. We're going to look at the evidence. We're going to look at what is laid out in the historical evidence and see whether or not it actually shows that Jesus rose from the dead. Okay, how do we know that Jesus died? First, some people are going to say, ha, you Christians and your myths, how do you even know that Jesus lived? Because we are not so ingrained in our biases and prejudices that we follow into what basically amounts to historical flat earthism. I'm sorry, but if you think that Jesus did not exist, go ahead and jump on the pile of conspiracy theorists like flat earthers and Holocaust deniers, because that's about how much sense that position makes. There is no historical scholar who says Jesus did not exist. You might find some fringe little people that somehow managed to get their hands on a PhD and get published somewhere. But I guarantee you, very, 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 very few of them exist. Jesus lived. It is a fact. Not only did he live, he died. Let's take a look at this. Now, it's easy for us as a Christian to sit here and say, oh, yes, here, because the Bible says so. Well, or we can quote our favorite scholars and theologians. But how about we go to the people who don't actually believe that Jesus is the Messiah, people who are not Christians. Atheist Gerd Ludemann actually is quoted as saying, Jesus' death as a consequence of crucifixion is indisputable. Not a Christian. Historian looks at the evidence and says, yeah, his death by crucifixion, indisputable. It happened. Okay, Paula Fredrickson, Jewish historian, so not a Christian, says the single most solid fact about Jesus' life is his death. He was executed by the Roman prefect Pontius Pilate on or around Passover in the manner Rome reserved particularly for political insurrectionists, namely crucifixion. John Dominic Crossan, he was part of the Jesus Seminar. These are the people that got together and said, hey, let's decide which parts of the Gospels are actually true. What are the words of Jesus that we think can actually be said are Jesus's? Not friends to the Bible, not friends to historic Orthodox Christianity. I think they came up with something like 10% of the letters in red were actually Jesus. And so that's where he's coming from, right? So no friend of just trying to push resurrection because he believes it. He says Jesus' death by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate is as sure as anything historical can ever be. So here, I just quoted three top-notch non-Christian scholars who say, yes, Jesus died by crucifixion under Pontius Pilate. Now, I was having this conversation with someone one time, and they said, well, that's great, but don't tell me what other people said. Show me the evidence. I want to see the evidence. Okay, well, what evidence do we have for the death of Jesus? Well, we actually have quite a bit. This list that I'm showing here, these are sources that are cited, that are pointed to as reliable sources about the death of Christ from agnostic, atheist, I guess, depending on which day you catch him on, historian Bart Ehrman. And he lists Paul, right? Now that's just Paul, like all the writings of Paul, right? So 13 letters, right? 7 if you're a skeptical, critical scholar. But so you have all the letters of Paul. You have Mark, John, Matthew, and Luke material. So whatever, there's some material in there that Matthew and Luke shared, whatever their source was. Hebrews, 1 Peter, Revelation, 1 Timothy, Tacitus, Josephus, Gospel of Thomas, and Gospel of Peter. And you say to yourself, but Mark, 1 Timothy was written by Paul. Well, Bart Ehrman doesn't think so. So that gives us another source. But here's the thing. These are all independent sources. That's what, 11 or 12 independent sources. Right? These aren't people copying each other and all sharing off each other's homework. Independent sources saying Jesus died. Okay, so we have death. John Dominic Crossan, I read that quote before, that crucifixion under Pontius Pilate as sure as anything can be, right? All of those pieces of historical evidence, this is the reason why these historians say that it is so sure. Let me read the last part of his quote. He says, "For if no follower of Jesus had written anything for 100 years after the crucifixion, we would still know about him from Josephus and Tacitus." So there's two non-Christian sources that are within 100 years of the life of the death of Jesus who were writing about it. And John Dominic Crossan, that two sources, that's enough for him to say, yeah, historically, you have two independent sources. That's historical corroboration. So what do these two sources say about the death of Jesus? Well, Tacitus, talking about the fire in Rome, Nero blames the Christians for it. Right? It says, Nero falsely charged with the guilt and punished Christians who were hated for their enormities. Christus, the founder of the name, was put to death by Pontius Pilate. There you go. Roman historian. And in this same segment, he actually refers to Christianity as, it was very negative, some kind of derogatory statement about it being superstition. I'm sorry, I don't remember the exact quote. No friend of Christianity, but he's pointing out Jesus was crucified by Pontius Pilate. Josephus, Jewish historian, so no friend of Christianity, writes, now there was about this time Jesus, and says a bunch of other stuff in between. He says, Pilate, at the suggestion of the principal men among us, had condemned him to the cross. So Tacitus and Josephus are two of the most kind of gold standard reliable historians of the first century, of that early time. And they say Jesus was crucified under Pontius Pilate. So therefore, we have that Jesus died. Which, because, by the way, if you really love science, science tells us you do not survive crucifixion. the amount of brutality and abuse that your body takes. And the Romans were very good at killing people. They're not making mistakes. You get crucified, you're dead. And so Jesus died. Nothing extraordinary, plenty of evidence. Jesus lived, Jesus died. Okay, well, that may be no big deal, but how do we know that he was seen alive, right? There's the real question. Okay, so Jesus seen alive again. Hold on. Thought I had a message. There may be some people who text in a question, so I was wanted to check that. Jesus being seen alive again, right? Because that's all you need to prove a resurrection. Dead guy, back to life. So is that what we get? Well, let's find out. Fact. Here's the fact from historians, and we'll get into this. There are multiple sincere claims of people seeing the risen Jesus individually and in groups. Multiple sincere individuals and groups. Okay? Well, what do the scholars have to say about it? Oh, see? Yeah. Okay. Boom. There we go. Mike Licona. Right? He says, this conclusion is granted by nearly unanimous consensus of modern scholars and may therefore be added to our historic bedrock. Right? So the consent of scholars, not just Christians, right, but across the world, all, knowledgeable New Testament scholars, the people studying this, say that this is historic bedrock, that there are multiple sincere claims from people who had claiming to seen the risen Jesus, individually and in groups. But he's a Christian. What does he know? He's all biased and wants to believe it and everything, right? That's what the critics claim. So let's go back to Paula Fredrickson, Jewish, not Christian. She describes the disciples' conviction that they had seen the risen Christ as historical bedrock facts, known past doubting. So this idea that, well, the disciples didn't actually claim to see Jesus. Yes, they did. They did. Historic bedrock, known past doubting. Again, Gerd Ludemann, atheist, says it may be taken as historically certain that Peter and the disciples had experiences after Jesus' death in which Jesus appeared to them as the risen Christ. Now, he's not saying he believes Jesus really was, the Christ and arose from the dead. And I believe it's Paula Fredrickson who would also say, look, I don't know what they saw, but they saw something. Right? So this is what they admit. They had some real experiences. These people don't want to actually say it was a resurrection, but they're admitting the historical evidence says that there were appearances, or at least reports of appearances. Well, okay, fine, that's what people say, but what's the evidence? Well, again, we have plenty in the New Testament source documents. Matthew, Luke, John, 1 Corinthians 15. We'll come back to that in a second. The sermons in Acts, especially of Peter. You realize that Luke, writing the book of Acts, whenever he says, okay, this sermon took place, he's not making that up. He got that from someone else. It was already the previous information available that said, hey, Peter got up and did this at Pentecost. Here's what he preached. Am I still hot? Hello? My sound went weird. Okay. So you have the sermons in Acts. They're saying, hey, and kind of like the central theme in the sermons in the book of Acts is Jesus, whom you crucified and rose again, right? Over and over again. Jesus, who was crucified and on the third day rose again. That is the central theme of the sermons in the book of Acts. And so that source there. You have the creeds, right? In the book of Acts, there are also different places where there are creeds. And a creed is some kind of saying, and it's done in some sort of poetic, lyrical form that's easy to remember. So these would have been traditional sayings and liturgy and lessons being passed around in the church. And so these would have been sources of what the church was teaching and believing. You also have writings of Josephus, also mentioning that they claim to have seen Jesus alive. And so these claims are there. They're established. Okay? So they claimed it. All right, fine. We've got these evidences right here. We've got these sources, and they say that they're claiming to have seen Jesus. But why should we believe that that really means that they had these appearances? Well, because we have a whole bunch of really good evidence. First off, we have I've seen kind of the popularized format of this is, using E's, right? There's the 6 E's of authenticity, because some people must have been Baptists, like to start things with all the same letter. First off, you have excruciating evidence. Okay, you have the fact that many of the apostles, people who would have been eyewitnesses to the resurrection if it happened, go to their death, or at least are willing to risk death in order to defend this notion. And so that just speaks of honesty, right? Because if you say, I saw this and it happened, and people say, no, say otherwise or we will kill you. And you, whatever, kill me. Can't change my mind. People don't tend to do that for things whenever they know it's not true. So this speaks to the truth of at least their convictions that they saw the risen Jesus, that they're not lying, they're not making it up, that they are being honest about their experience. One of the reasons that I said we'd come back to 1 Corinthians 15 is because it is the earliest evidence that we have. Now, Paul was writing it in the 50s, but he says in 1 Corinthians 15, I gave to you what I received. And then he goes through this creed that he had received. And when did he receive it? Scholars point to that he would have received it whenever he went to Jerusalem. Okay, so that's just a few years after the crucifixion that Paul would have received it from the apostles. Well, if that's when he received it, hey, a few years after the crucifixion, that's pretty good. But if he received it at that time, that means it was already in place, already the established teaching of the church, which pushes it back even closer. Some scholars have said that possibly even within a few months of Jesus' crucifixion, not necessarily years. But even if it's years, that is fantastic evidence. Because whenever you have early evidence, that speaks of its authenticity. It's closer to the events. And it would have been easier for people to disprove early on whenever it was still fresh in everybody's minds, and the fact that this would have originated in Jerusalem, the very place where these events supposedly happened. So if they're making it up, it would have been crazy easy for people to say, no, that didn't happen. However, that's not what happens. It stands the test of time. We have multiple independent, right? Whenever we give you this list, Matthew, Luke, John, all of this, these are all independent sources. They're not copying each other's homework. Independent sources. Multiple attesting independent sources. That Jesus appeared to multiple people on multiple occasions. That he appeared to Peter, he appeared to James, he appeared to Paul, to the 12, to all of the apostles, and then finally 500 brethren. Which has been pointed out, if you use the same kind of math that you would use, like when we talk about the feeding of the 5,000, that it was 5,000 men, so it could have been even more. Well, this is the 500 brethren that he appeared to, so it could have been, were there women there and they just weren't counted? I mean, well, so you have to figure that out. Could have been even more. We have this evidence. It's early. It is enemy attested. Right? Hostile witnesses are saying that this happened. You have Paul, who was an enemy of the church. He was persecuting Christians. He had orders to go arrest them. He even either participated in or approved of the killing of Christians. Right? And so you have him who then converts and becomes Paul and is, the greatest missionary of the early church. You have James, the brother of Jesus, right? Who by all accounts in Scripture, he is not believing Jesus until after the resurrection. And now he is a believer. You have the Jews. Now, how did the Jews attest to Jesus rising again? Well, in Matthew 28, you have the report of the stolen body, or the conspiracy of the stolen body, where the soldiers come back to the priests and they say, hey, he's gone. And the chief priests say, well, tell people that the disciples stole the body, or that you fell asleep and the disciples came and stole the body. And that argument about the stolen body is circulated quite a bit in the early church. It's even a theory that some people put forward today. Well, you don't need to worry about whether or not a body was stolen if he's still in the tomb, which adds to the idea of the resurrection. Also, the fact that Jewish priests became believers, because did they have some inside knowledge about what was going on? Did they know about the cover-up? Did they see the conspiracy to frame Jesus and say, hey, something's going on here? Speculation, I admit, pure speculation, but piece of evidence. Okay. We also have the fact that these were eyewitnesses. The pieces of evidence that we have, many of these are coming from people who were in the position to know that it was Jesus who had died and that they were seen. So again, lots of good evidence. The reports, we have that Jesus was seen alive. Okay? Reliable reports that they think that Jesus was alive. I think that this shows the death is confirmed. The reports that he was seen alive are confirmed. That gets us to the appearance of a resurrection. And remember, it is rational and reasonable it is rational and reasonable to accept as true the way things appear to be. So what it appears to be is that Jesus died and he was seen again later. And some people say, well, hold on a second, right? Doesn't necessarily mean it has to be a resurrection. There could be some other explanation. Well, that's fine. If there's another explanation that can undermine the resurrection, let's hear it, because as it stands, the reasonable conclusion is resurrection. So unless we can have a defeater, some idea, some evidence that tells us, some explanation that shows us that it was not the resurrection, then resurrection is what we've got. Well, some people will say, no, see, he didn't really die. Right? This is popular, people call it the swoon theory. But as I've already said, you can't survive crucifixion. And all the evidence says he died. So that actually flies in the face of the evidence. You actually have to believe that one despite all the evidence otherwise. I say, well, the disciples lied. Maybe that's what it is. Okay, sure, they say they saw him, but maybe they're lying. But as we've already said, right, drop my notes. As we've already said, they're not going to give their life for something they know is a lie. That just doesn't happen. And you might say, well, you could. Well, okay, one person does? Because we know for a fact, historically, that at least Peter, Paul, James, and John, and Stephen were martyred. The other disciples, we have good reason to think many of them were, and even if they weren't, they were definitely willing to be. And so one person might say, but over and over and over and over again, nobody recants? No, that just doesn't add up. Plus, in order to be a lie, it would have to be a conspiracy. And conspiracies do not work. In order for a conspiracy to work, you have to have a small number of people with really good communication and low pressure. Here you have a whole bunch of people, really bad communication, and tons of pressure because of persecution. So, no, it just doesn't make sense that they would lie. Say, oh, well, you know what? They hallucinated then, right? They thought they saw him. Well, here's the thing, though. You don't share hallucinations. right? One of the ways you know you're not hallucinating is you go, hey, do you see that? And the person goes, yeah, I see it too. And you know you're not hallucinating. Plus, hallucinations are, I believe, always, I think always, single sensory, right? You only hallucinate visually, or you might hallucinate like you think you see something, or maybe you think you hear something, but you don't both see and hear something. In the appearances of Jesus, they see him, they hear him, they interact with him. So hallucination doesn't work. Some people say, well, it's an imposter, someone pretending to be Jesus. Really? Someone who was so good a con man as to fool the disciples who walked with Jesus 24/7 for 3.5 years and his own family? That one doesn't work. Some people say, well, you know, the story changed over time, right? Initially, it wasn't that he raised from the dead. That was something that kind of evolved in a later legend that came about. No. The earliest evidence that we have, that creed from 1 Corinthians 15, which dates back to within years, maybe even months of the crucifixion, says he rose from the dead and appeared to the disciples. So story changing, legend developing is not an option. Resurrection is the option. Some other people, things like to say stolen body, we talked about, the tomb was guarded. Who was stealing it? Some people say, oh, they went to the wrong tomb. Well, okay, they may have gone to the wrong tomb once, but it's not like they didn't know where the place was. They could have figured it out and gone to the right tomb later. People say, well, history can't prove a miracle. That is just bias. At this point, if you are rejecting the resurrection because it's miraculous, that is your own personal prejudice against miracles, not because of the evidence, not because of reason. So here we have the resurrection. It is the most sensible. It is the way it seems to be. There are no defeaters, no explanations, no other contrary evidence being offered. And so the historical evidence indicates that Jesus did indeed rise from the dead. The end. Or is it? Okay. Are there any questions? I think I flew through that, even talked a little faster than normal. Threw a lot at you, but I tried to even kind of keep it simple. But there is so much more on this topic alone. The bulk of the information that I used for this presentation came from a video series that I think is like a 32 part series. And even the information presented in that is tip of the iceberg. So we're like the snowflake on the tip of the iceberg of the evidence that shows the resurrection. So there you have it. If there are any questions, put it in the chat there, or church members, if you have my number, you can go and text it to me. If not, it looks like there we go. Resurrection proven in 2 steps. Look at there. Some people argue with 4 facts. I only needed 2. Just saying. All right. Okay. Well, I am not seeing any questions. I guess we'll just go ahead and maybe wrap it up. But I want to go ahead and say thank you for those who were there. Maybe if you're going to be seeing this later, I will go back and look at this. And if the live stream quality is not very good, I might be able to do something about that and upload a better quality video later. So we'll see on that. Still on lockdown. Services, 11 o'clock, Sunday mornings. Next Wednesday, we're going to continue on our course through church history. We finished up the Reformation. We're going to get into the modern times, 2 or 3 sessions on that probably. And then we'll see what comes after that. And the question and answer on April 26th, which will also be live online. Any questions that you have, you can go ahead and send them in to me early so we can get a start on that. Hopefully we'll have a good old time there. Okay, no questions. We are done. Thank you. Have a wonderful night. Okay, hold on a second. I said good night. I don't know what is going on because I am not seeing questions here, but I see questions on the streaming service. So I'm not sure. We do have time. Let me take a look at this and see what the question was. Here is my one question. If I was decapitated and examined by doctors and pronounced completely dead, then later my head was reattached and I came back to life, would that demonstrate the supernatural? How would it demonstrate the supernatural? Okay. Okay. No, you're not being mistreated. Honestly, I mean, I can show you the live chat because I had it pulled up right here so that if there were any questions, I could see them, and there is nothing there. And so, all right, well. Oh, now it shows up. Okay, good, awesome. Great. Yeah, we have a fun conversation with you. So if you were decapitated, examined by doctors, pronounced completely dead, and later your head was reattached and I came back to life, would that demonstrate the supernatural? Yes. Yes, it would. And if you say, no, it wouldn't, I'm sorry. I'm okay. I'm not trying to be snarky. This is just one of those things where it's like, yes, of course it would. Yes, it would. Because if you are dead, head cut off, there is no life. It's gone unless you accept naturalism, where our physical material self is all there is, which is a bankrupt ideology. Then yes, of course it's evidence for the supernatural. Of course it's evidence that something supernatural has taken place. Because it is not possible to happen naturally. It would have to be supernatural. So yeah, I'm sorry, I got a little animated on that one because that kind of, what's really funny, I think part of the reason is because discussion I was listening to yesterday with Gary Habermas and Mike Licona, and he actually brought this example is something he brought up because people will say, you need extraordinary evidence. He said, no, regular evidence will do it. And the example he gave was, what if, he was in an auditorium full of people, someone came in, chopped his head off, and he died, right? And then, right, he comes back and oh, look, no, I'm okay. My head's on. Let me see, there's the scar, but I'm all better now, right? Regular old testimony is all you need, right? No kind of special, amazing evidence, right? Regular old evidence is all you would need for that. And so I thought it was kind of funny that he was actually using the same kind of example as showing that, look, regular kind of testimony evidence can show you supernatural things. And then here you bring this question about, the exact same example. So yes, I actually do think that would be an example of the supernatural. I would actually find it very difficult if someone were to say, I don't accept that as supernatural. Okay, I don't know what to say to you because it obviously is. So, yeah, okay. All right. Promise you'll play nice. Okay. I'm reading through the comments because there were several. Like I said, I don't know why these weren't showing up. I specifically had my phone here so I would see them, and I didn't see them. All right. Since you're the only one commenting, I guess I'll let you have some monopoly on here. I think it's telling that you told us, this is the comment, you told us that if you come with the idea that the Bible could be fiction, then you can't evaluate it. That's not what I said. I said that you approach the Bible as historical documents because that's what they are. Doesn't mean they're true. Doesn't mean the things contained in them are right. It doesn't mean that, because there are documents we have in history where it's clearly made up, right? There are, what is it? When we were talking about Old Testament, there's an Assyrian inscription. The Assyrians were really, really bad about it, where they would actually have carvings on the wall and then engrave the accomplishments of the king and just the wonderful battles he did, where he went in and he slayed hundreds of thousands of people. The city didn't even have hundreds of thousands of people. That's historical evidence. That is not accurate, right? And so that's possible, right? I'm not saying that just because it's something from history that you must accept it as true. No, you can come to it and say, is it really telling the truth? But by the canons of historicity, well, first off, the genre of the documents of the New Testament do not lend themselves to thinking that these are, just automatically fiction. Plus, the idea of fiction is hundreds of years later. People actually sitting down and going, I'm going to write a story about something that never actually happened and just make it up completely. Right? You might have polemics, right? Where they, or a parable, right? Where it's like a not quite true story, but it's telling something true. The idea of fiction, though, wasn't really a deal back then. So no, it's not that you have to assume they're true, but you have to come to it with an open mind that these are historical documents, right? These are actual documents produced in the first century legitimately, like you would any other piece of documentation, right? If you uncover the diary of Caesar whoever, right, that's a historical document. Doesn't mean everything he says in it is true, but it is a historical document. You are basically saying you must believe first and reason later. No, that is absolutely not what I said. Dude, come on, man. You don't need to be given all of that. I mean, that's just, you're putting words in my mouth. That is absolutely not what I said. Believe first, reason later. No, what I'm saying is don't come with the position that it can't be true until you prove me otherwise. No, you this kind of rabid skepticism that some people seem to have, you got to just shed that of your thinking. That right there is poison thinking. But no, you don't have to come to it already believing, but you do need to come to it with an open mind. If I tell you, I thought you just said one question, man. This is more than one question. If I tell you I own a car, that seems reasonable, doesn't it? Yeah, sure. Now, if I tell you I own a Ferrari, you would probably need more evidence to support that, wouldn't you? No, I don't know you. Maybe you have a Ferrari. Maybe you had a rich uncle. Maybe you had, I don't know, maybe you hit the lotto, bought a Ferrari. If you come to, hey man, I have a Ferrari. Okay. I don't have any reason to not believe you. And so, especially if I'm having an open mind, because I've known some just crazy wealthy people. I've been around, I wouldn't say I'm buddy with some millionaires, but I've known some people that, can change the local economy with what they decide to invest in. But you wouldn't know it to look at them. I've known people that someone, after years of knowing the person, someone goes, they're like a multimillionaire. I'm like, what? No way. I wouldn't have had a clue. So, you know what? If you say you have a Ferrari, good for you, man. Good for you. You don't convict. Here we go. Another one. Let's see what we got. You don't convict someone of murder based on a traffic light camera. You do, however, give people tickets for running red lights. I have no idea what that's supposed to mean. Telling you, come on, dude, now you're just trolling. Mark is wrong. He's just telling us to stop thinking. No, I'm telling you to start thinking. To just completely remove just the rabid skepticism that just eats away your ability to reason. That's not, so actually start thinking. That's really what here we go. Okay, last one, because we're almost out of time, but I'm having fun. This is great. Okay, I can refute this with one argument. All right. All we need to do is lower our standard of evidence until we accept this clearly flawed argument. Well, I don't really advocate lowering your standards. I'm saying raise your standards. How many times has Mark told us to stop thinking? 0. Told you to start thinking. Here's my one question. Okay, yeah, and then I answer you. There was more than one. Come on, man. Lines of sin. All right. There we go. Oh, thank you. Oh, dude, there's more. I'm sorry. I can't keep going. It's after time. Got to get home. Got to get kids to bed. Thank you for playing, though. You know what? I got these right here. On April 26th, okay, Blaster Master 80, on April 26th, we have our question and answer event where it will be me and 2 or 3 other guys who are trained, educated, ministers and scholars here to answer your questions. So go save some up, right? Can't do them all in one day. All right. Thank you. Have a wonderful night.